Okay. So, a few facts and figures about the poverty problem. There are about 7 billion people in the world, as you know, a few more now. In October 2011, the 7 billion mark was breached. And of those, very large numbers suffer from various kinds of poverty-related deprivations, in particular, chronic undernutrition, lack of access to essential medicines, lack of safe drinking water, lack of adequate shelter, electricity, sanitation, literacy, and there's still also a great deal of child labor, meaning children working outside their own household for wages. Now, in many ways, you might say that these horrific figures understate the poverty problem because they're snapshot figures. They show you what the world is like at any particular moment in time, and so they overrepresent the people whose lives are longer and underrepresent the people whose lives are shorter, right? The people whose lives are longer get counted many more times in these snapshots than the people who have short lives. So if you take these numbers are hypothetical, they're just rough estimates, so don't take those as data, but you can see here that if we assume that the life expectancy in the poorest quintile is a lot less than the life expectancy in the other quintiles, then it is entirely consistent to say that about a third of all human lives are lived in the bottom quintile, in the bottom fifth of the world's population. It sounds paradoxical, but it's nevertheless true because the living and dying, the births and deaths are in much more rapid succession, or putting it a little bit coldly, there's more turnover in the bottom quintile than in the other quintiles. Now here's a statistic that does not make that mistake of overrepresenting those with long life expectancies. It simply looks at how people die and therefore automatically counts each person exactly once. There are about 58 million deaths every year, and about 18 million of those are from poverty-related causes, and you can see here what they are. And this is a very conservative statistic in that I've only counted those causes of death that are unknown among rich populations, virtually unknown. Poor people die from the same causes we die from also, and often much earlier than we do because they have greater vulnerabilities due to their environment and also fewer remedies, lousy medical care, for example. And so you could say there are many more premature deaths that are from causes that are only too well known among us, but I've not counted any of those. So just by counting only these causes of death that essentially don't exist in the affluent countries, you get to somewhere around 18 million annually. Now, if you put that in perspective and compare that with the great disasters of the 20th century, you find that roughly 400 million people died in the 22 years since the end of the Cold War from poverty-related causes, as compared to about 200 million people who died in the entire 20th century from government-sponsored violence of one sort or another, including the gulags, the concentration camps, the Great Leap Forward in China, and of course the wars and the civil wars. So poverty really is a very major catastrophe, a very major problem. And it obviously invokes human rights. We're all committed to the list of human rights, certainly the ones listed in the Universal Declaration, further specified and complemented in the covenants and many other human rights documents. And here's the formulation from the Universal Declaration. We are all committed to everybody having a right to a standard of living adequate for the health and well-being of oneself and one's family, food, clothing, housing, and medical care, necessary social services. And you can see that for at least half the human population, this right is not fulfilled. So this is massively underfulfilled and certainly the most underfulfilled or least realized human right on the list. Now, if you ask yourself, why is this happening, right? It sort of jars a little bit with the rah-rah that we get in the media, all this good news about how there's economic growth and how things have been getting better in the period after the Second World War. The superficial answer why this is happening, why there is still so much poverty around and real extreme poverty, the superficial reason is the income distribution in the world. So I show you here the distribution of income in terms of segments of the human population. You line up all the people in the world, all the households to be precise, and you slice them into horizontal slices. This is the top 5% of the human population, 46.36% of global household income. This is the part of income that is spent by private individuals or households. This is the next 20%, just about the same share. And so what you see here now is the top quarter, which includes, of course, all of you. And this is the second quarter, the third, and this is the eye test, the final quarter, the bottom quarter, with 0.78% of global household income, a very tiny fraction. Even the bottom half together has less than 3% of global household income. Now, I have little breaks built in if you want them. If you shouldn't get into major discussions, but if you have any questions on about understanding what I'm saying or something, you want anything in more detail or something, feel free. You know this guy? You know her? Anybody? Mary Wollstonecraft. This is my thesis advisor. And you know this guy? Amartya Sen. This is just to break the ice, so if you're shy, maybe you can... Anything, or should I just press on? Good, so that's a superficial explanation. Now I want to get into a somewhat more in-depth explanation. I think a very important part of why we have so much inequality in the world has to do with regulatory capture. Regulatory capture is something that is very well known and well understood and well analyzed, and certainly we have now election season, so you see it in live, right, on your very screen. You can see that there are a lot of people giving a lot of money. The US election is likely to cost about $6 billion, much of it, actually pretty much all of it, privately funded. And you've got to ask yourself, you know, why are people giving $6 billion for an election, for candidates in an election? Well, you know, some are doing it because they believe in that a particular candidate is going to promote the common good or justice or something like that. But a lot of people are giving money, especially big corporations and so on, because they want to influence the people who hold office and influence who holds office. And it's unlikely that this sort of money is going to be without effect. In fact, there was a wonderful statistic recently where people have broken the secret of the stock market. They've divided the S&P 500 companies, the top 500 companies in the US, into the top 50 lobbyists, those who relative to their earnings are spending the most money on lobbying. And that S&P 50 so-called, the top lobbying people, they had a gain of 12% over a 10-year period, vis-a-vis a gain of somewhere like 1% in the stock market value of the S&P 500 as a whole. So if you really want to make money in the stock market, apparently what you have to do is buy companies that are you taking notes? Buy companies that are spending a lot of money on lobbying. So inequality spirals basically work this way. Very strong participants, people who are already advantaged, who already have disproportionately large shares of the social product, they find it both in their interest and also they have better opportunities, more experience and so on to lobby. So there's the obvious phenomenon that lobbying is worthwhile the more you have, right? If I, with my salary, if I started to lobby for a special tax break for professors or something like that, I'd save $1,000, maybe $2,000. Nice, but it's not worth my while to go through reams of tax code and trying to influence legislators and so on. If I were a hedge fund manager, on the other hand, I might save $20 million a year in taxes by having a special tax rate. And that's why hedge fund managers have a special tax rate of 15%, as opposed to people like you and me who pay somewhere in the mid-30s. So I hope you all know that, right? That there's a special tax rate for hedge fund managers. Everybody says that it makes no sense that hedge fund managers have the special lower tax rate, but they do, and the Congress reaffirms it. So they have special incentives, special opportunities, special expertise, and so on to engage in cost-effective lobbying. And of course, they will do that if and insofar as the investment that they make in lobbying will bring returns that are greater than these investments in terms of rule changes for them. So, and that then leads to a kind of inequality spiral, you might say, where in each round, those people who are relatively advantaged lobby more, get returns, shift the rules in their own favor, and have even more in the next round. Now, I'm saying that something like this also happens at the global level. We have supranational institutions emerging in the last 20, 30 years in particular, and these supranational institutions are very heavily lobbied over and have been shaped to the benefit of the strongest parties in many ways. Now, the counter-argument that is often made to this, and actually is very popular, and you find it in The Economist magazine almost in every week's edition, is that this can't be true because poverty develops differently in different countries. So in some countries, poverty has disappeared very quickly. In other countries, it has gotten worse and worse, and because of these great dramatic divergences in countries, it can't be true that supranational institutions are to blame or have anything to do with the trajectory of poverty in the various countries and in the world at large, because they are all governed by the same supranational institutional order. Now, the initial response to this counter-argument is to say it's a non sequitur. It's a non sequitur in that the differentials or the differences in the trajectories in the evolution of poverty in different countries proves, of course, that there are differences among those countries, but it doesn't prove that global or supranational institutions don't play a role. So to show that very quickly and economically, take the parallel example of teaching, where you say, let's say at Yale, at the end of my class, I find that student performance differs. Some students have learned a huge amount, other students have learned very little. And if this argument were correct, you would conclude from the great differences in learning success among the students that obviously the teacher is irrelevant to student success, because they were all in the same class, and so if students are underperforming, it can't be the teacher. Now, we all know that that's idiotic, right? So the teacher obviously has an impact on how well the class is doing. A good teacher will maybe lift all students' performance. A bad teacher will lower the performance of all the students. But even the differences among the students will be influenced by the teacher in at least two ways. One is that teachers will, by selecting a certain teaching style, certain teaching materials, cater more to students with certain kinds of needs and capacities and preparations than to others. And so if you, for example, teach with a lot of numbers on the screen, certain students will find that difficult and forbidding, other students will really cherish it. And if you did it with fewer numbers and more words, you'd have the inverse effect. And secondly, even some of the student-specific factors that are clearly important to student learning success are ones that the teacher influences. So a sexist teacher, for example, may turn off a number of women students and some of the male students who just say, well, this dinosaur, right, if he is such a sexist in this day and age, then why should I listen to what he has to say about these other things? So even the student-specific factors can be influenced. So in all these different ways, the global factor teacher will have an impact on student success and differentials in student success. And quite similarly, it's entirely conceivable that supranational institutions will have an influence on the performance of different countries in terms of economic development and poverty eradication, as well as on the differentials between different countries, that China and Korea are doing well and others are doing poorly. Good, so the argument is a non sequitur, but nonetheless, I think we should also look at some of the details, and I'll do that in a moment. But let me first say, extend a little bit this inequality spiral kind of regulatory capture argument that I canvassed earlier by saying that the supranational order is a new thing, right? There've always been rules of the game internationally, but this very influential, very dense supranational order that has emerged in the last 20-25 years, that's a relatively new phenomenon, and the formative period where this order was taking shape and became very influential obviously is one that is especially important for shaping this order for the future. So people understood that we are living at a crucial historical moment where we can, in fact, have a huge influence on how the rules of the future will be shaped, the international rules, and on how these rules will impact the distribution of future social products. And so various people who are intelligent and who make it their business to think about rule formation and trying to influence rule formation, basically the whole lobbying community and those who pay the lobbying community, thought about this very carefully and paid a lot of attention, spent a lot of money on trying to influence this supranational order that was then taking place, and also trying to shift rules upward to try to support this move to more and more of day-to-day interactions being shaped by rules that are actually supranational. Now, the reason for that is that these rules are, for the most part, formed under conditions that are ideal for lobbying, conditions which are not democratic. It's governments getting together, conditions where there is very little transparency and very little accountability. So it's very difficult to tell, even ex post, who was arguing for a particular language that made it into a particular treaty. And so in that environment, it's pretty easy if you have access to a government, and if that government can then carry your interests forward into the negotiations, it's pretty easy, without being found out, without anybody knowing that you are influencing things, to try to influence things. And that, I think, happened quite massively. So, I mean, one case that I've studied quite a bit is the TRIPS agreement, which is connected to the healthcare project that you were kind enough to mention. The TRIPS agreement was a fantastic lobbying effort where 4 industries, surprise, surprise, software, entertainment, the agribusinesses, and the pharma companies, found a common platform. It was difficult because they had different interests, but they arranged themselves and then went to Washington and said, this is what we want. This is what we want you, Clinton, to get for us in the Uruguay round as we inaugurate the World Trade Organization. So the US here is obviously a crucial player for 2 reasons. The US is by far the most influential player in these negotiations still, and certainly was in the 1990s. And the US is also the softest target in the sense that here, more than anywhere else, politics really is for sale. It's auctioned off, and so you can get influence through lobbying and spending money. Now, if this explanation were true, or at least part of the truth, which is all that I'm claiming, then you would expect that those in a position to lobby the US government would have done particularly well throughout this period. And this is actually what we find. This is data from your friends at the IRS. The income share of the poorest half of the US population dropped by more than half over the 78-07 period, 29-year period. And you can see that the gains were concentrated at the very top. That's an interesting thing. So the Occupy Wall Street crowd with their 1%, they're not far off. In fact, it's actually less than 1% in many ways. The 1% benefited, but if you go down and fine-tune to the top 10th and the top 100th of 1%, you get even more spectacular gains. You get a 7-fold increase in the income share of the top 100th of 1%. So that's really quite dramatic. Now, the top 100th of 1% of the US population, just to give you a sense, that's 14,400 tax returns, roughly 30,000 people in those households. And these 30,000 people have now nearly half as much income as the bottom half, as you can see at the top. And they have roughly 2/3 as much income as the bottom half of the world's population. So 30,000 people on the one hand, 3.5 billion people on the other hand. And the former have roughly 2/3 as much income as the latter. Now, those of you who have taken elementary economics have maybe come across something called the Kuznets Curve. Have you heard of that? The Kuznets Curve was a very popular thing at an earlier time. It's not much heard about now. But in all elementary economics classes, one of the things you learned, one of the things that we know in economics that are pretty predictable is that as a country develops, inequality will go up. But don't worry, it will come back down. So the Kuznets curve has this shape, or I should go in this way for you. So that's exactly what happened in the United States. We had increasing inequality in the United States till about 28, 29, then decreasing inequality in the United States till about 78, and then we just went off the rails. The Kuznets curve notwithstanding, inequality has increased ever since, and it has now increased to the point where we are back at the peak that we reached, or if not slightly above that peak, which we reached just before the Great Depression. Not a heartening thing. Okay, what I have here for you, so I'm saying basically I'm giving you this data to say there is something to this lobbying story, that those in a position to lobby the US government really did do very well. So at least there is preliminary evidence. Now, what are the main things, the main parts of our supranational institutional rule system that are particularly favorable to big corporations, banks, industry associations, and so forth? So protectionism is something very well studied, is on the top of everybody's list. Even people at the other side of the political spectrum are often lamenting the fact that so much money is spent on subsidizing, for example, agricultural produce, export credits, and so on. So that's a clear thing. $250 billion go for subsidies alone. There's still various kinds of tariffs and quotas that are anti-dumping duties and so on that are hampering exports by poor countries into world markets because, of course, poor countries cannot afford to match these kinds of measures. Pollution rules, it's pretty obvious the rich countries are responsible for a disproportionate share of pollution. The poor countries are taking a lot of the harm from pollution, and if there were any kind of fair compensation for the harm that this pollution does, the poor would do a lot better than they are doing. Illicit financial flows is a problem that I'm just getting into with an IBA, International Bar Association task force that I'm chairing. And that's simply enormous amounts of monetary outflows that are facilitated by weak banking systems, or rather banking systems that are poorly policed. There are some controls on monies that might be related to terrorism and drug dealing. But apart from that, if you're trafficking in human beings, for example, your money is welcome, not just in tax havens, but also in places like the United States and the United Kingdom, which are themselves tax havens of sorts for a lot of these dirty money outflows. The total that flows out of developing countries every year is estimated between $1 and $1.2 trillion, about 10 times as much as all development assistance taken together. So it's a huge headwind against development, which consists basically of embezzlement of various kinds and also of tax evasion. So one very big outflow is that the big multinational corporations conduct a great deal of internal trade from one subsidiary to the other, and that's roughly 60% of global trade already. International trade is from subsidiaries of the same company, and so they control the price that one subsidiary is charging the other and can thereby manipulate where the company makes its profit. So if you want, you can, if you, let's say, produce in India and sell in South Africa, you can sell from India at a low price to Bermuda, and then from Bermuda at a high price to South Africa, ensuring that you make a big profit in Bermuda and no profit in India, no profit in South Africa. You do that because in Bermuda, the tax rates on profits are low. You can also make sure that all your trademarks are owned in one of these tax havens, and that then your subsidiaries, where you get higher taxes, pay high fees for the use of the trademark. Very common trick. Or you can have a consultancy group that is giving advice, consulting advice about how to run your company or something like that, out of Switzerland or out of Bermuda. And so again, a good bit of what would otherwise be profit in the developing country gets siphoned off into a tax haven. Privileges. We recognize any person or group on the basis of effective power alone as entitled to sell the resources of a country and to load the country up with debts. That happens massively, and so very often countries, after a period of dictatorship, find themselves heavily indebted and much poorer in resources than they were at the beginning of the period. And of course, the authoritarian group or clique or individual that ruled them is not going to reimburse them in any way, and they will have to cope with the fallout. Often, these rulers, dictatorial rulers, can maintain themselves in power with exactly the money that they make through resource sales and loans. Pharmaceuticals we've already mentioned. Basically, we get enormous amounts of money sucked out of poor countries through royalties of one sort or another, licensing fees for patents, for trademarks, for copyrights, and so on. The US is now apparently making more money from royalties than through its fabled agricultural exports. So tremendous amounts of money are coming into the rich countries, flowing out of the poor countries in that way. I'll leave the other two to your imagination, but the point basically is that these rules were heavily contested. Those who are more able to lobby the governments that are influential are in a better position to influence the shaping of the rules, and have actually succeeded in shaping these rules in a way that increases their own advantage and gives them the opportunity to increase their share of global household income. So this is what this diagram is supposed to show. This is basically the same information that I gave you earlier as a pie chart, now a little bit differently displayed, and you can see here why if I flip back and forth a little bit. This is a 17-year period and how the distribution of global household income changed over this period. What you can see here is that only the top 5% of the human population had a gain. All the other segments of the human population had losses. And you can also easily see that the losses in the bottom quarter, at the bottom left-hand corner there, are the greatest of all. It's in relative terms, right? The poorest quarter lost a third of its share of global household income during that 17-year period. So here are the key facts one more time. In these 17 years, the top 5% gained 3.5% of global household income, which is more than the bottom half had left at the end of the period. The bottom half had less than 3.5% at the end of the period, less than 3 actually, less than what the top 5% gained. The ratio of average incomes of the richest 5% and the bottom the bottom quarter increased quite dramatically by roughly 50% during that period. If the poorer half had just defended its share, if they just held steady, they would now have 21% more than they actually have. And the poorest quarter, if they had just held steady, would have 49% more than they actually have. Had the poorer half been allowed to gain the same 3.5% that was in fact gained by the top 5%, the bottom half would have doubled its share of global household income and would have broken through the $3 mark, which is in 2005, the end of the period, the median income. So in 2005, everybody could have been at or above the median income of that time if the 3.5% gain had gone to the bottom half instead of to the top 5%. So what you learn here, I think, is that large as it may be in human terms, the global poverty problem is actually quite small in economic terms. It's not a big deal, right? They have less than 3%. If they had 6% or 7%, at least severe poverty would be history. And the good old people at the top half, would still have 93% of global household income, and the top 5% could still have 45% or 44% of global household income. So poverty isn't such a big deal, but of course, if the distribution changes against you at a pretty rapid clip, then the increases in the size of the pie, the increases in global household income, per capita income, are not going to really lift people out of poverty. Good, I've got another break. Oh. Any questions, comments?
Have you given any thought to the extent to which people who are better off, or corporations who are better off, are able and in fact have subsidized ideas that would make effective counteraction to what you're talking about more possible? So just to put an idea out there, I mean, take Rawlsian ideas and Nozickian ideas. Do you think that there's, in addition to lobbying, which is a very specific way to influence things, do you think that there's a systematic effort to subsidize publicity for libertarian or Tea Party points of view to the detriment of Rawlsian points of view? Speaking just very broadly.
Yeah, I've just had a very interesting conversation about this actually with one of your colleagues, but I think that calling it a systematic effort, I think, is too strong. I think there are efforts of that sort, but a lot of the stuff, in my view, works through more subtle channels. That I think that the economics profession in particular is very heavily fought over. Economists are the theologians of the modern era. They are the people in the white coats, the specialists who are telling you very professionally but very firmly that XYZ is the right theory. This is the way to develop, right? And if you don't get it, that's too bad. You're a philosopher, you're excused. But please, go back to Hegel and don't disturb our serious business here, and so on. So there's a bit of that going on. And with regard to the economists, I think there are career advantages to saying the kinds of things that are on the same wavelength, that support the going consensus, right? And this works indirectly through the Treasury Department, through the World Bank. Sometimes it's very much on the surface, so you have somebody like Stiglitz getting fired famously from the World Bank and so on, or discontinued. But I think for the most part, these things are subtle, that people like professional economists will sense that their career will go better if they go with the going consensus. So I think there is such an influence. It's not uniform, it's not sort of, but definitely yes. Again, others may know more about that who have studied these kinds of influence. Anyway, anything else, or should I just press on? There'll be more Q&A at the end, probably. Good, so I'll talk a little bit about the reaction and the MDGs. That's what I will mainly focus on from now on. So what happened in response to these sort of somewhat bad news from the poverty front? What happened in response was that, of course, there are the usual summits and promises, of which one very important one was the World Food Summit in Rome, where the assembled governments promised to halve the number of chronically undernourished people between 1996 and 2015. This was 1996, so this is not yet MDG. This is a few years earlier than the MDGs. And you can see here what that promise entails. You have a 50% reduction in the number of undernourished. So the goal was 394. And these are the numbers until a few days ago. Just a few days ago, they completely revised all the chronic undernutrition numbers, greatly increasing the number of undernourished in the year 1990 and greatly reducing the ones now with a new methodology. I'll say a little bit about that later, even though I haven't seen the methodology yet. Anyway, so you see that at least according to the old methodology, which governed until a few days ago, according to the old one, things didn't go so well, right? 788 was supposed to be halved, and in fact, we never got back down to 788. Things went up, and with the food price spike in 2008, 2009, we broke through the 1 billion mark for the first time in human history, again, according to the old methodology. Now, that meant a 17% regress between 1996 and 2010, to which one reaction then was the formulation of the first Millennium Development Goal, which again retained the idea of halving the number of chronically undernourished by 2015, but made a few fundamental changes. One was to backdate the baseline to 1990, and the other one was to formulate it in a proportion to the population of the developing countries, which means that the halving is much easier because the population of the developing countries grows very substantially between 1990 and 2015. And with that growth in the denominator, less work needs to be done in terms of reducing the numerator in order to get the halving of the proportion. Right? Is clear? So a 3.58% annual reduction that was envisaged at the World Food Summit in Rome was superseded by a 1.37% annual reduction, which is MDG 1. This is the text. And so if you do that in numbers, right, you had 843 is the old number for 1990. You relate that to the population of the LDCs and half that. So what's halved here is now this column, and get a new target of 596 million, and suddenly it looks like you have made 17% progress towards the goal by simply having shifted the goalposts. This is the thing graphically. So the old goal, the old glide path was the red one, and the new glide path the blue one. And the same thing with extreme poverty, where 3 succeeding glide paths were formulated. This happened, by the way, without any attention by the media. I tried to get the media excited about this in 2003, 2004, but failed utterly in getting any echo. A very small paper in Germany printed 800 words for me, but didn't change the world, I have to say. Sorry. So, and this is the joke from Kofi Annan, who in his first report on the MDGs was able to announce that in the most populous region of the world, East Asia and the Pacific, where poverty had been 28% in 1990 and so was supposed to go down to 14% by 2015, the MDG number 1 was achieved already in 1999, a whole year before it was even announced. So that's the advantage of backdating the baseline to 1990. So I'll see whether this will inspire more. Anything on this, or should I just press on? Press on, I take it. Okay, so I've got a brief little thing on human rights, just to basically make the point that human rights are often conceived in interactional terms, that you say human rights violations quintessentially happen when agents, including collective agents such as countries or armies, are acting in ways that foreseeably and avoidably leads to the underfulfillment of human rights. But I think the same is also true with, or one way in which they can do that is through designing institutions that have the foreseeable and avoidable effect of leaving human rights underfulfilled or making human rights underfulfilled. And That's an unfamiliar thought, but I think a thought that is helpful in dealing with this persistent poverty. I think that many of the institutions that we have designed on the global level are ones that foreseeably and avoidably cause great human rights deficits to persist, despite the fact that we are getting richer and richer on average, and could very easily design these institutions in a way that would avoid these human rights deficits. So maybe I can go over this quickly and conclude with two citizen responsibilities, namely that insofar as we play a role through our country in designing rules that are human rights violating, we have two responsibilities. One is to work toward reforms, and the other is to compensate for our fair share of the harm that we together do through our government in shaping these supranational institutions. And that gets me to the forthcoming replacement of the MDGs. The MDGs are ending in 2015, and so there's now a big commission in place, and everybody and their aunt are working on trying to find replacements for the MDGs, including a big coalition of social society organizations, civil society organizations, NGOs, and so on, 380 of them, combined in a big coalition called Beyond 2015, which ASAP organization that I am a member of is very strongly collaborating in, and we have a network of academics who help us in trying to work very quickly on responses to things that are being proposed and so on, trying to work hard on influencing that process. The UN has opened a little window, so there is the opportunity to weigh in with proposals and suggestions, but of course whether we will have any influence is another matter. But at the very least we should do our very best to make sure that it can't be said at the end that there wasn't anything coming from civil society, that no proposals were made. So the most fundamental thing that I think we should keep in mind as we go forward into the post-MDG period is that the MDGs were really not goals in any real sense. The MDGs were wishes or hopes, right? You said, well, poverty should halve. Sure, that's good. And this thing should go down by 3/4 and so on. But to say that something should go down or that something should happen is different from a goal which is normally attached to a particular agent, where there is an identifiable agent who has that goal or who ought to have that goal or is being told that they ought to have that goal or something of that sort. That really never happened, and so the MDGs became this thing where everybody was kind of like in an elevator looking at the others and saying or suggesting that the others were not doing enough. The rich countries came into the role of watching a dog race where they were saying, well, Cameroon is slightly ahead of South Africa isn't doing so well, and so on. And the poor countries were saying, well, the rich countries are really not doing anything, and there isn't enough of an effort to fulfill these goals. So instead of detached goals where we all agree that something should happen, but without any kind of agreement on who should do what in order to make it happen, what we need is something like agreed responsibilities where you have specific agents who take responsibility to do specific things, especially when things don't move along the glide path, when things are not going down the way they should. Several MDGs, as you know, we are nowhere near fulfilling them, and hunger was one of them until a few days ago. And so that's something where obviously special responsibilities should have kicked in, saying we should now do X, Y, Z in order to make this happen. Now, the second point is that about the MDGs is that we shouldn't, in assigning responsibilities, assign them to that tiny little niche of our supranational architecture, which is called development assistance. Development assistance is, on the one hand, not large enough to really make a difference. On the other hand, it is also not efficient enough to make a difference. We can do much more and do it much more cost effectively if we bring the imperative of poverty avoidance into the other 99.9% of our supranational institutional architecture where all the harm is done. So rather than have harmful rules all over the place and then have a tiny little appendix of development assistance that tries to make up for some of the damage, we should try to bring the important concern of poverty avoidance into the mainstream of the supranational rules that govern our world, and take the interests of the poor seriously when we design these rules rather than merely compensating for design flaws. Good, and so what I'm proposing then is a whole bunch of institutional reform goals, and I'll quickly run through them. We can deepen some of them if you want. But basically, here they are, sort of a tax on trade distorting subventions. So if the Swiss want to continue subsidizing their cows, they can, because what would Switzerland be without the cows and the bells around their necks and so on? Not a viable industry in a free market, but if they want, they can, but at least then they have to compensate the rest of the world through a kind of tax or fee for these trade distorting subventions. A tax on greenhouse gas emissions that would again be designed to compensate in particular poor and vulnerable populations for the harm that, and it's already today very substantial harm, that climate change and pollution are doing to them. A tax, and a very hefty tax, on arms exports to less developed countries. Again, you won't be able, I think, to stop these arms exports, but at the very least you can maybe put a tax on them for the interest of poverty eradication. Again, poor people suffer horrendously from the effects of the weapons that are being poured into, by the tens of billions of dollars a year, into the less developed countries. I would suggest an alternative minimum tax on multinational corporate profits in order to avoid the problem that I sketched earlier, where many corporations have huge amounts of profit, realize these profits in low tax or no tax jurisdictions and never pay any taxes on them, and just say, well, whatever taxes you have already paid get subtracted, but every corporation should pay at least 10%, let's say, on its corporate profits, no matter how much it is actually paying to particular states. We should end the practice of accounts with unknown owners or beneficiaries, which are still quite common in many jurisdictions. A recent Economist article said that it's actually easiest to open such accounts in the United States and the United Kingdom, where you least questions asked. We should have some restraints on debts and make sure that unrepresentative governments are not capable of indebting anybody but themselves. So they can take out personal loans if they want, and Citibank can give them personal loans if Citibank wants, but the country should not be held liable for loans that somebody like Sani Abacha or Obiang or Mobutu Sese Seko or whatever these friendly people might be called are taking out. We should tax natural resource purchases from similarly unrepresentative governments. It's unrealistic to ask that nobody buy those resources. We need these resources desperately, but at the very least there should be some tax in order to penalize purchases that are not in the interests of the people whose resources these resources really are. And finally, the health impact fund idea that you were kind enough to mention, we should try to open up a second track on which pharmaceutical innovations can be rewarded according to health impact, rather than be rewarded by enormous markups that make these medicines unavailable, inaccessible to poor people all over the world during the time that they're under patent. Good, thank you.
Very provocative set of proposals, and now we have a good opportunity for questions and answers. I'll allow you to recognize folks.
Good, will do. Yes, please.
I'd like to know, these are far-reaching ideas, but who would this global IRS be, and if such a thing were created, how would the world protect this institution from being plundered by its own officials?
Yeah, good question. So obviously this has to be carefully thought through. The best model that I've come across in my study of these things that has worked reasonably well with reasonably large amounts of money is the Global Fund. The Global Fund is dedicated to disease, and in particular 3 diseases, AIDS, TB, and malaria, and is spending in the order of $3-4 billion annually. It works closely with the World Bank. The World Bank is the organization that looks at their accounts and keeps everything straight and narrow. There have been problems, highly publicized problems of money going astray in various developing countries. That's happened, but it's in the order of magnitude of 1%, so $37-38 million on a $3 billion budget. So it's not been dramatic. And I think, again, I have no objection to the World Bank being in charge of the accounting of such things, and also in charge of the spending of the money. The spending, I've said nothing about how the money that these number 1, 2, 3, and so on, 4, how these monies should be spent. We could get together without much trouble something in the order of 80, 90, $100 billion annually, which is not a lot, but is, given the size of the problem, but would make a real dent. One favorite thing I would spend it on is, of course, the Health Impact Fund. I would want that to be funded. But also things like the Global Fund could be put on a more permanent footing. It's now has very insecure funding, has to go around every 3 years, head in hand, trying to collect money from governments and from the Gates Foundation and so on. So the key thing in general that I would say about the spending is you can get mileage out of spending in 2 different ways. One is directly by spending money on something. The other is by having perspicacious, transparent, predictable rules according to which you spend the money. And these rules themselves have incentive effects. And so that's the point of the Health Impact Fund, that you have put money out there at the end of the rainbow, so to speak, and say to companies, if you come up with a new drug that really makes a difference to patients, there will be money for you. And that elicits certain kinds of behavior. And similarly, you can have deterrence built into the rules and say, for example, that if you behave in such and such a way, you will not be eligible for any money from this humanitarian fund, and thereby up behavior in that way. So these incentive effects should be fully exploited. A lot of what's wrong with today's development assistance is that it's always quite ad hoc. So you have government officials dispensing the money. They are driven by a whole range of objectives. So they want, of course, to see that poverty declines in this or that African country, but they also want that the head of state of that country votes in favor of our invasion of Iraq or whatever else we might have going at the time. And so there's a whole set of different objectives. And of course, the people running those countries are only too adept. One thing that they're very good at is exploiting these multiple objectives and saying, look, it's true, we haven't done much for poverty, we've had to buy a lot of arms and so on, but we are voting for you on this issue and we are willing to do this other thing for you and so on. So it's one of those things where the wardens think that they are manipulating the inmates, but the inmates think that they are manipulating the wardens and so on.
Just have one further comment as far as trying to actually implement such a thing on a far smaller basis. The state of Washington just tried to pass a first ever state income tax to be implemented. It was supported by Bill Gates' father, who directs the foundation, and it only would have been a 1% tax on incomes above $400K. But the 3 top corporations in the state came out firmly against it, including Bill Gates' successor, Steve Ballmer, who, as it turns out, he said, if you can't afford it, we'll leave the state. And at last count, he was down to his last $14 billion personally. How likely do you think any of these things could actually occur? It was defeated 36 to 64.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, look, I mean, the thing is, we have our generation, I mean, I'm talking to you personally, not the younger crowd here, but our generation has been a real failure in terms of looking after the justice of the rule system that governs the world, right? Things looked good at some point in the 60s and 70s. There was a lot of concern for justice, and it seemed like we were winning, more or less, or at least shifting the world in the direction of greater justice, greater enlightenment, and so on and so forth. And then came a fantastic backlash, and so things have moved backward. And so if I look at this whole thing soberly and extend present trends, I can't be very optimistic. But on the other hand, I can also not just sit on my hands and say, well, let the poor die and let them suffer and not do anything about it. So we have to find intelligent ways. And so I think what would be bad would be being defeatist and thinking that there's nothing you can do. And it would also be bad to overlook the enormous complexity of the system that we are facing. It's not that there's a united front, sort of a big ruling class who are conspiring and are talking with each other on a daily basis to see what the agenda is. But they all have diverse different interests, and so you can collaborate with forces that are prudentially interested in a certain reform. You know, you can, for example, with the insurance companies, maybe press through a reform that is not in the interest of the pharmaceutical companies and so on and so forth. So I think with intelligence, there is a good bit that we can do, and we just have to try to get on with it. And even if we can't achieve a whole lot, every little bit helps, shifts the balance in the right direction and so on. We have to stop this inequality spiral, right? If things continue in the same direction with the top 5% getting fatter and fatter, right? In 17 years, getting 3.5% more of global household income, that's a pretty bad slope, a pretty rapid change that we have to at least arrest and try to reverse if we can. Yep.
So I think these are all great ideas, of course, but I found it a bit curious that you would choose a tax both for trade distortions and greenhouse gas emissions. Could you explain a little bit your reasoning behind that, particularly since something like greenhouse gas emissions is sort of a problem in and of itself without its relationship to poverty eradication?
Yeah, but isn't that just the reason for it, right? A tax on greenhouse gas emissions does good both at the input and on the output side. We are reducing greenhouse gas emissions by making them more expensive, and we are raising some money in the process. And it's something where we can make common cause with conservationists, environmentalists, of which I'm one as well. So I care about both these things, poverty and the environment. So I don't see exactly what your objection is there.
Well, I mean, I think, like, for example, a cap and trade system would, of course, be more efficient in reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which would have subsequent effects on world agriculture. In the same respect that just banning subsidies towards, agriculture, in particular, or energy, would have more of a direct effect on local markets and allowing people to build up energy infrastructure or agricultural infrastructure themselves instead of just punishing those who are building these systems.
Yeah, I'm happy with the cap and trade system in addition, but a cap and trade system would not normally raise any revenues, right? So this is a method of, in addition, raising revenues and thereby making the entire operation, the entire polluting operation more expensive. And that in turn would likely, it would obviously be reflected in consumer prices. So it would make resource-intensive consumer expenditures more expensive and the less intensive ones less expensive. And so shift consumer behavior from going for a drive to maybe getting a massage or something,
But in what sense would that tax apply to practices in the developing world? Because you could make
The tax would be, I haven't shown the details here. I've got the details. Each one has its own slide, but I didn't want to bore you. So it's above 4 tons per person per year.
Only the individual tax.
Yeah, the tax would be on the country. So the country would pay the tax, but the country would then presumably try to get that tax back or distribute that tax according to resource intensive. So you'd have, for example, a higher gasoline tax. Out of gasoline tax revenues, the US would then pay that tax. Yeah, so 1, 2, and then...
Thank you for your talk. I have 2 questions. The first one is, how do we better integrate social entrepreneurs, especially grassroots movements, but even the ones that are now more transnational? And that's the other coin of the private actors, right, in global politics, especially into the institutional framework. So how do we better support such action, as well as how do we think about them in 2015 as those actors that emerged in a way that they didn't in 96, right? So talk a little bit more about that. more about what kind of ethics you're envisioning with responsibility?
Good, I'll try. So this social entrepreneurship and impact investing and so on is now all the rage. So I've spent 2 hours this morning talking with different people in that space, which is very, very interesting. And the way I see us connecting with them is in particular in making the environment in which they operate more hospitable. Right? There's some really good people out there. One good friend of mine, for example, is the founder of SamaSource, which is an outsourcing company that connects corporations in rich countries with workers in poor countries who can do, with today's easily information flows and so on, they can do bookkeeping and budgeting and all sorts of tasks can be outsourced to them, and people in developing countries have a job, and the company here saves money and so on. There's a big microinsurance thing. Again, a good friend of mine who's running that, a big fund called Leapfrog, that does microinsurance all over the developing world and so on. So these things are thriving, but I think we can still improve the conditions. I see the Health Impact Fund idea as justifiable exactly along those lines, that you say here are all sorts of biotech companies and public-private partnerships that desperately want to develop new medicines and make them accessible to patients all over the world, including poor patients at low prices. But under the present system, where the only way they can make any money is by marking up the price, it's very difficult for them to do that. If they were the Health Impact Fund that allowed innovators to be rewarded on the basis of health impact, then they could thrive, right? So DNDi could develop a new medicine, could sell it very cheaply, as they always plan to do, could make money on these cheap sales for the health impact that these sales achieve, and then invest that money immediately into doing the next research on the next drug, rather than having to run around head in hand trying to raise enough money from donors and whatever to replenish their coffers, right? So that's the basic idea. We should think intelligently. I don't pretend to have done that comprehensively, but these are just examples to try to create an environment in which this kind of entrepreneurship can thrive, in which it is even more profitable to engage in these kinds of ventures. Now, the second thing about responsibility, there are basically 2 points, and I'm not sure how connected they really are. One point has to do with why did the MDGs really not change anything? They didn't really move the needle, right? There's a lot of insider information that I got where people said that these goals were essentially designed, quantitatively speaking, in such a way that normal trends continuing, that's where we would go anywhere. So you put something out there and then pretend that you've achieved something, but nobody really did anything extra or did anything special in order to achieve these MDGs. So here the notion of responsibility is supposed to connect goals, and these should be more ambitious obviously than the MDGs were, with concrete agents who have to do something in order to achieve these goals. So that's the first idea, that you can't expect goals, so-called goals, to have an impact in the real world if you don't connect them to particular agents who are called upon to do specific things in order to achieve these goals. The second point about responsibilities, when you ask about the broader ethics and so on, that's simply that I think that the responsibilities that we have with regard to global poverty are vastly more stringent than most people believe, right? Most people would be drawn into something like the Singer debate, Peter Singer debate, with his example of the child in the shallow pond, where I, of course, completely agree with Singer that, yes, if there is a child in the shallow pond, and even if I wear expensive trousers, I have to wade in and get the child out, and so similarly, I have responsibility and so on. But what I'm saying, in addition, is that we are not as innocent with regard to poor people in the developing world as Singer's professor is with regard to the kid in the pond. So Singer tells the story of a bystander, basically a bywalker, if you like, who is fishing out the kid or has the opportunity to do so. And we are not bywalkers or bystanders. We are people who are responsible for the actions of our government, including the actions of this government as being the big boy on the block when it comes to negotiating supranational institutional arrangements. And our government, in our name, has done an enormous amount of damage in designing this rule architecture. And so we have a responsibility, a moral responsibility for some of that harm backward-looking, and forward-looking a responsibility to rectify this harm in one way or the other. And the two ways are institutional reform and compensation. But you were next.
I see a lot of hope, contrary to the American neoliberal system in the world, coming out of the people's movements of Latin America. Recently, in the past 10 years or so, there have been lots of populist presidents elected. Lula da Silva in Brazil, Zelaya in Honduras, Morales in Bolivia. Do you think that their social programs, their populist programs, definitely unpopular with the U.S., are actually making a dent on the problem of poverty in their nations?
And is it transportable?
And is it transportable? And do they deserve the demonization that the U.S. kind of
they don't deserve the demonization.
And actually, kind of the CIA assisted in removing Zelaya from power in Honduras and the president of Paraguay earlier in 2010, I believe.
Yeah, so I agree with you that these are very promising developments, and in particular that, Lula's presidency was really, one of the few positive surprises, right? I expected a lot, but it blew me away. It was much better than I even expected. And these are very effective programs that he brought in, including the Bolsa Familia program and the retired sharecropper program and so on. And they really made a difference to poverty. Brazil was off the charts and still is pretty much off the charts in terms of inequality. It's one of the most inegalitarian countries in the world. But it's one of the few countries where inequality has come down. And in fact, in pretty much all of Latin America, inequality has come down on the national level, right? So I think these are very good programs. Whether they can work in other countries is a difficult question. Lula has, I was just there on a fact-finding mission about this illicit financial flows project in Rio. And the interesting thing is that he's also incredibly increased tax compliance with an incredibly efficient system. And that's something that works only if you have some modicum of sort of anti-corruption integrity in the tax collection system, can somehow get integrity going. And that will be very difficult in some of the African countries that are particularly resource rich, where the resource sector is very large, where correspondingly top politicians, presidents for the most part, are not really beholden to anybody, right? They just live off the resources. They don't have any tax base that could rebel against them. They just sell off the people's natural resource. So it may not work as well in Africa, but I think these phenomena are very, very promising. And of course, what's also very promising is that the southern countries, and in particular IPSA, which is now, IPSA is India, Brazil, and South Africa, which is emerging as a big force, also as an intellectual force, right? They are, 20 years ago, even 10 years ago, there was basically no communication across the developing world. So from India to at a high level, regular, it was all flowing through the Geneva, through Washington, and so on. But now they have their own meetings. They think about what programs to push at the international level and so on. And that is a very good phenomenon, I think, to think carefully about what the collective interest of the developing countries is. So long as you have governments that are representative, that really care about the people of the country and the poorer half of the people in particular, which Lula quite evidently did, and a lot of the people you mentioned quite evidently do, but which the majority of less developed country leaders are not doing to anything like the same extent. So your success story is counterbalanced by South Africa, for example, where you have an increase in inequality and where really the poor people ask themselves, what the hell is this? You know, the apartheid has been over for all these years and we are no better off, in fact, often worse off than we were under apartheid. So it's a mixed picture. Yeah. I hope it's not necessary because it's going to be so very, very hard to achieve. It's a very, very important part of the problem, right? If we could achieve campaign finance reform, half this would go away. It would be so. It's as you say, it's a very, very neuralgic, very important point. But how are we going to achieve that? By the way, it was also one of the very few points that my thesis advisor, who was all very ethereal and very philosophical and so on. But this was one thing that roiled him, that really boiled his blood. He wrote this essay, The Basic Liberties and Their Priority, where he was just railing against Buckley v. Vallejo, which was a 1976 Supreme Court judgment striking down campaign reform. And not the only one, right? We had Citizens United in the recent past, and it's just absurd, for a Supreme Court, which is supposed to have some intelligence, to say that the First Amendment, freedom of speech, is violated when companies cannot give infinite amounts of money for super PACs? I mean, come on. Freedom of speech is violated? I hand over a brown paper bag with large amounts of money to some political candidates? Anyway, it doesn't make any sense to me at all. And it's, of course, contested. It could be overruled by some Supreme Court or other. But until that happens, right, we are stuck. It's not even the Congress can pass anything. And a constitutional revision of the First Amendment, good luck. I mean, it's not going to happen, right? So the only thing that might change that is a few more appointments to the Supreme Court that would shift the Supreme Court towards reason on that point. Hugely important. Any other? Yes, please. 1, 2, 3. Sorry.
Sorry. I was just wondering if you see, I guess, any irony in regards to your audience on this lecture when talking about like inequality spirals and campaign finance reform, given like the close associations that probably like some of the biggest beneficiaries of the current system have with like the universities they're associated with.
You're speaking about this university in particular?
Well, elite universities in general. Like,
Yeah,
a lot of
yeah,
students here are like perhaps the children of like corporate executives.
Yeah. I teach at Yale. I mean, this is, whatever you have here, we've got 10 times as much. And so I could rattle off a whole bunch of last names that I've come across in my classes and in the university yes, there is. I mean, do I see irony in that? I went to Yale partly. I was at Columbia before. I went to Yale partly because I thought, stop preaching to the converted, right? Columbia is more converted. And at Yale, I'm really sort of a bit of an odd creature. And a bunch of people who are from these very rich families actually come to my classes and actually get a second opinion, which I think is quite, I don't feel that I shouldn't be doing this. I think this is a good thing to do. And if 1 or 2 or 3 of them become a little bit more open-minded to another point of view and maybe to how the world looks like from a less privileged vantage point, this can only be good, right? So I believe that moral reasons can influence the world. They are not the strongest force by any means, but they can sometimes, when you direct this force intelligently, they can really make a difference.
Yes. Well, first question is, you have more detailed explanations of these.
Yeah.
proposals.
You want
Are
the
they
proof?
online, or, can I
Here they are.
access them since I'm teaching until
Yeah, I'm more than happy to. I have no secret agendas or something like that. My stuff is open to anybody.
Great. The second question is about a tension between two things that you try to do. I think. On the one hand, your work is about human rights and it has a political edge to it, a very important one. And at the same time, you are proposing remedies for poverty. So it puts you sort of in the humanitarian end of it as well. And there do seem to be at times tensions between pragmatic tensions, if you will, on the ground between trying to do both of these at the same time. So as I read your work, you do propose sanctions to try to implement some of your reforms. And at the same time, of course, discussed the wealthy countries for refusing to go along with the important reforms, the GRD taxes, but perhaps also the corrupt governments
Mhm.
in the developing world. That makes it difficult for you to distribute your global resource dividend, the tax revenues that you collect. Actually, I think I'm trying to remember, but when you talk about the global resource dividend in world poverty and human rights, you do make compliance among the receiver countries as sort of a condition for
Yeah.
receivables. Have you given that any more thought? I'm just curious.
Yeah, so I think this is one of those things where the tension disappears when you take a broader view, when you look more long-term and you pay attention to the incentive effects that I mentioned earlier in response to the first question about the deterrent effects and so on. So it's true that sometimes, let's say you have a rule against giving money that you raise through the global resources dividend or through some of these proposals. You have a rule against forking those over to certain governments that are unrepresentative, let's say, and are not abiding by certain rules, are not using enough of the money for the benefit of the population and so on. Now, by not handing over the money, you are also hurting the people whom you want to help or the people whom you want to protect because, again, the country is then starved of revenues and so on. But if you then also consider the reduced likelihood that governments that are not eligible for these disbursements come to power and maintain themselves in power, then the picture changes again, right? You might say that a general policy of not handing over money to people of a certain sort reduces the incidence of people of that sort. And that would be on the plus side. So the other thing that mitigates, I think, is that we have a huge poverty problem out there. And so it's not that we are embarrassed for places to put our money, right? There are other places where we can channel that money to people or for the benefit of people who are just as poor, perhaps, as the people we are now denying or to whose leader we are now denying revenues. Sometimes we can reach the very same people through different channels, for example, through effective NGOs and so on. But of course, there are cases where NGOs are not allowed to operate, like in North Korea, for example. It's very difficult for, if not impossible, for most NGOs to operate. And in that case, we can say, well, yes, that's very regrettable that we cannot effectively operate in North Korea, but there are other places where very poor people live, where we can operate effectively. And so the money doesn't go to waste. It still gets channeled to its proper purpose.
Yeah, so like you said, obviously the Millennium Goals are kind of ending in 2015. And I was just wondering, because obviously they're all so linked together, and the overcoming poverty is a precursor to a lot of the other ones, like education and health improvements. I was just really wondering why you decided to focus so much on poverty in this, and if you knew whether there were other kind of reforms going on for the other 7 goals, and kind of the progress or lack thereof that has been made toward those, and how that's going to continue post-2015.
Good. So I'm very grateful for that question. So the point is I have a much broader conception of poverty than money metric poverty as the World Bank conceives of it. And I've actually been in trench warfare with the good folks from the World Bank for something like a decade on exactly that problem. And so the things, most of the other stuff that's in the MDGs belongs there. I should say, I'm near the end of a very large Australian Research Council and Oxfam funded research project where we did, it's called Toward New Indices for Measuring Poverty and Gender Disparity. That's the official title. So we've done field work in 6 developing countries, actually 2 rounds of field work that are concluded. We have a 3rd round of field work ahead, and we are trying to develop a comprehensive measure. And one of the things that emerged, we started that project with a much broader conception of poverty than the money metric, and the project itself pushed us to even broaden it out further. So when you are a philosopher like I am, you sort of come to the problem, you say, well, necessary and sufficient conditions, what counts as poverty? Well, this is conceptually a mistake, you can't call this poverty, it's a category mistake or something, and so on. But when you talk to poor people and you say, so what is highlight for me, what is it like to be poor? What do you think are the essential elements? One thing that came up a lot is being subjected to violence. Not having a place where you are secure, where you can lock a door between yourself and others and so on. You're exposed to violence, or having to walk long distances to fetch water and so on, where you are exposed to violence. And then, of course, the philosopher might say, the sort of insensitive philosopher might say, well, that doesn't belong here. This is something completely different. Well, it isn't completely different. It's part and parcel of the experience of being poor, and then you can make some subtle distinction between constituents of poverty and effects of poverty or something like that. But in the end, we decided that the best way to proceed was just to put these things together as a cluster without trying to draw too subtle a distinction between conceptual, according to conceptual lines that might not even exist in the same way in other languages and so on, and really just be responsive to what are the most important problems that poor people perceive in their situation and go from there. Good.
Terrific. After listening to a discussion of moral reasoning in politics on a debate night, I probably ought to release people to go to make their own moral judgments about the political debate that's about to happen this evening. But please join me in thanking Professor Pogge for a really terrific and thoughtful